Hello and welcome to Critical Weight Theory. So, when the movie X hit theaters in March 2022, many horror fans expected a little more than another throwback slasher, a bloody love letter to the grindhouse films of the 1970s. After all, the marketing promised a group of young people isolated on a rural Texas farm, an unsettling elderly couple, and plenty of gruesome kills. Instead, audiences got something a little stranger, maybe a little bit smarter, and more emotionally unsettling, actually. So it's a little bit of a surprise movie. And it was written, directed, produced, and edited by Ty West. X became one of A24's biggest horror successes and quickly earned a reputation as one of the defining horror films of the decade. And people still talk about it today. Critics praised it as both an exhilarating slasher and an unexpectedly thoughtful meditation on aging, beauty, ambition, sexuality, and mortality. So, yes, today I'm taking a closer look at X, how it reinvented the slasher formula, why Mia Goth's remarkable dual performance became the film's defining achievement, and how one independent horror movie unexpectedly grew into an acclaimed trilogy. Although, that was actually kind of the plan all along. So, what's the setup here? Well, the story takes place in 1979 during the heyday of grindhouse cinema. A small crew rents a secluded farmhouse in rural Texas under the pretense of making an ordinary movie. But it's not quite so ordinary what they're up to. Their real goal is to secretly film an adult feature titled The Farmer's Daughter, and that's why I am considering this a smut movie review, because there are some smutty moments in this film, and it's kind of marketed in the way that you're going to think it might be a smuttier horror film. And don't get me wrong, like I said, there is some of that, but it's not as dirty as you might think. In fact, if your household is, not too squeamish about blood and some nudity here and there and some simulated sex, you might be able to have your family tolerate this film. So it's not quite as smutty as the marketing might suggest, but it is still kind of a smut film. Uh, they're making this feature called The Farmer's Daughter, kind of a classic smut film setup. And I'm not using the P word here because guess what? YouTube frowns upon that. Um, Producer Wayne, he's a character in the movie. He sees that type of content as the next great entertainment industry. And his girlfriend, Maxine Minx, dreams of becoming a star. And of course, she is also a cocaine addict, or a cokehead, if you will, as were a lot of people at the time. And I'm sure there are still plenty of those people out there right now. Maybe some of you are listening to this. I don't know. Um, anyway, we've also got adult film actors Bobby Lynn and Jackson Hole, who bring charisma and confidence to the production. And director RJ wants to create what he believes will be sophisticated adult cinema. Well, I don't know how sophisticated it would be, but he maybe has some delusions of grandeur that make him seem like a rather naive character, at least as naive as the young starlets in such a film might be. Although one of the interesting things about the this movie is that these characters, I mean, other than RJ, they actually don't seem that naive about what they're doing. They seem clear-headed, and Maxine, she does believe she's going to be a star, but she doesn't seem too delusional about it, in my opinion. She's kind of down to earth while still wanting some fame. And RJ's shy girlfriend Lorraine reluctantly tags along as the sound technician, and she's an interesting character because she has a transformative moment in the film, and it's a little bit of a complex character transformation, and it kind of reveals some truths about proximity to this type of culture. It can kind of suck you in, you know. No pun intended, I guess. But anyway, at first the production goes surprisingly smoothly, but the farm's elderly owners, Howard and his wife Pearl, I want you to remember that name, Pearl, because it's a big name in this franchise. But anyway, Howard and Pearl begin taking an unsettling interest in their youthful guests. As night falls, admiration turns into obsession, and before long, the farmhouse becomes the setting for one of modern horror's bloodiest survival stories. Well, okay, it's probably not the bloodiest horror movie. In fact, yeah, you know, it's probably tame for some people. The point of this movie isn't exactly the carnage, although there is definitely some of it. But it's a little bit more like an old school horror flick where it wasn't as much about the blood and gore. Although again, there is some of it, and you've got to give some credit for Mia Goth's incredible double role here. And it's one of X's biggest surprises that Mia Goth doesn't simply play the heroine; she also plays the film's primary antagonist, Pearl. There, I spoiled it, but that part kind of gets spoiled early on in the film anyway. And this movie's been out for some time, so I guess I don't feel that guilty about it. Through extensive prosthetic makeup, Goth transforms herself into Pearl, the elderly woman whose desperate longing for youth drives much of the story's horror. And Ty West has described Maxine and Pearl as different characters but the same person. At least I think that was Ty West who said that. I have him quoted as saying it anyway. So basically, it's like they're mirrors of one another, and that kind of makes the movie a little interesting. And Maxine is young, ambitious, sexually confident, and convinced that she has the X factor needed to become famous. And Pearl once believed pretty much exactly the same thing about herself. Now she's elderly, physically frail, emotionally isolated, and painfully aware that beauty and opportunity have disappeared for her forever. And she doesn't like that. So, casting the same actress in both roles transforms Pearl from a simple movie monster into something much more tragic. She's not merely jealous of youth, she's mourning the life she believes was stolen from her. And that makes this more than just a slasher in some ways, you know? Like many great horror films, X uses violence to explore much larger ideas. And that's not to say every movie uh, that's a slasher or a horror film needs to be complex or character driven. Far from it. There are plenty of fun, dumb horror flicks out there that I would give positive reviews to. But sometimes if a movie has that little extra something, that little bit of depth, it can really go a long way in terms of making a movie a little more memorable. And the central theme is the conflict between youth and old age. Nearly every interaction reminds us that beauty fades, bodies fail, and time eventually catches everyone. And Pearl doesn't simply want affection, she wants to feel young again. She wants to be desired. She wants another chance, and she's kind of lashing out because she knows she's running out of time. And the film also explores sexuality in an unusually nuanced way. It's not as finger waggy as a lot of people think movies have to be. I think people nowadays, I don't want to sound like I'm a crotchety old timer here myself, but I think sometimes people forget that movies don't always have to be perfectly moralistic. They don't always have to be preachy. Um, but whatever. I'm not gonna go too far. I'm not gonna expand that point too far. I'm just going to say, sometimes a movie can have conflicting points of view, and I think this movie really gets into that. It's not a simplistic narrative about what is right and what is wrong. Although, of course, it's wrong to like murder people and stuff. I don't think the movie's messaging is that uh, that conflicting when it comes to that. But when it comes to like the adult film industry, this movie kind of reminds you that there is something a little bit wrong with being prudish, and just being strictly anti that kind of film, because the people in this film, the actors, they're playing people who seem real, and they have real reasons for doing what they're doing. They're not just completely immoral perverts or whatever. In some ways they're rebellious, but they're also down to earth. They're not like totally off in la la land, like thinking that there is nothing whatsoever wrong with the industry that they're in. I mean that they seem to understand that there's a taboo element, and at least one of the characters ends up with more conflicting feelings about it than the others. So this movie really does have some mixed messaging, which is like real life. Anyway, classic slashers often punish characters for engaging in sexual, uh, well, just having sex, and for doing drugs and stuff like that. But X intentionally rejects that tradition. This adult film and its performers are surprisingly likable, supportive, and emotionally healthy, actually. And their profession is not presented as simply sinful or deserving of punishment. Instead, the violence grows out of Pearl's longing and resentment. If anything, this movie kind of makes what they're doing look like it's fun, almost like the idealized version of that type of content. And I know there are some problems in that industry, of course. I mean, that's in some ways part of its perverted appeal, right? The fact that you've got taboo elements, and it can be exciting to break taboos. Well, that's part of the reason that that industry thrives in the first place. And this movie, it doesn't shy away from kind of hinting at that point. And it's you get into Pearl's longing and resentment. Her frustration comes from losing something she can never recover. It's not just from moral outrage, although I think those two characters, Pearl and her husband, they both have some moral outrage to sort of justify their, I don't know, their freakish behavior. But nevertheless, it's not just from a sense of morality. It's from they're jealous of the characters. And the movie also touches on ambition and the pursuit of fame. Every member of the film crew dreams of making something meaningful. Maxine especially believes she's destined for greatness. And running throughout the story is another subtle theme: the terror of being forgotten. Like, Pearl fears irrelevance, Maxine fears never becoming relevant in the first place, and they're opposite sides of the same nightmare. And yes, religion plays a role here too. Without giving away every twist, I'll just say that Maxine's mysterious televangelist father introduces ideas about hypocrisy, shame, and the tension between religious condemnation and personal freedom. And like I said before, this is sort of like a love letter to 1970s horror, but it's a little bit more complex, but it's something like that. Visually, X feels like it could have been released alongside the horror classics that no doubt inspired it. Ty West deliberately seemed to embrace vintage filmmaking techniques. You've got the dusty Texas farmhouse that immediately recalls the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The uncomfortable intimacy between Pearl and her guests sort of echoes Psycho, the way Norman Bates has these awkward, close interactions with the different characters in the movie, especially his victim. you know, uh, I guess that would be another spoiler I just did right there. But most of you have seen Psycho, I'm sure, if you're horror fans. And the deliberate pacing and creeping dread owe something to movies like The Shining. So there's also natural lighting, I think. I'm not exactly an expert on lighting, but it looks like a lot of natural lighting. Long stretches of quiet, patient camera movements. This isn't a movie that moves at like a million miles per hour. There's some vintage style cinematography, and together they recreate the atmosphere of exploitation cinema without becoming mere imitation. And rather than parodying the era, West recreates its texture while telling an entirely modern story. And that's what kind of sets this movie apart. It really does have a different dynamic going on. And behind the scenes, let's do that a little bit. Let's look behind the scenes. Although X is set in Texas, filming actually took place in New Zealand during the COVID-19 pandemic, and that unusual production led to one of modern horror's most remarkable accomplishments. While everyone was already on location, Ty West and Mia Goth secretly made an entirely second movie. The film became Pearl, the trilogy's sequel. Or, no, the trilogy's prequel, I should say. And there is a sequel to this, but it comes after Pearl. Now, I had seen Pearl first in the movie theater, and I'm kind of glad that I saw that because I do think Pearl is the superior film in some ways. Um, and if I had seen X first, I'm not sure I would have appreciated this movie as much. It's a weird sort of thing, but I'm kind of glad I saw Pearl first. I still haven't seen Maxine, but it will happen eventually. I'm going to get around to it at some point. But I did just recently watch X for the first time, and it led to this review. So instead of waiting years between installments, Ty West captured both films while the cast, crew, sets, and creative momentum were already in place. And the result is a pair of movies that complement one another remarkably well. And that, of course, is all part of the X trilogy. X eventually became the first chapter in what fans now call the X trilogy. Pearl, which was released later in 2022, travels back to 1918 to tell the origin story of the elderly killer. Rather than another slasher, it becomes a colorful psychological character study showing how Pearl's dreams gradually curdled into obsession and violence. So, like I said, that's actually, in my view, a better movie than this. But this movie is actually still good, if not great. And the trilogy concludes with Maxine, released in 2024. And I do plan on seeing that, like I said. That movie is set in 1980s Hollywood. It follows Maxine as she continues pursuing fame, determined to become the star she always believed she could be. And across three films, Ty West explores recurring themes of desire, celebrity, aging, sexuality, and the American dream through three distinct cinematic styles and three different eras, basically. Although, of course, Maxine is a little bit closer in time to uh, X, because X is, just in the late 70s. And each movie stands on its own, but together they tell one larger story. And that's another thing that's nice about these movies. Say you just want to watch one and you have no interest in the others for whatever reason, you'll probably be okay, if that's the way you roll for whatever reason. And these were well. I'll just stay focused on this movie. This movie was a critical and commercial success. It was produced for roughly $1 million, which, in terms of movie money, that's like nothing basically. X earned more than $20 million worldwide, making it quite an impressive independent success. Now, it's not the most impressive independent success ever, but it was still pretty impressive. And it had a lot of good production on it. Mia Goth's performance received a lot of acclaim. And reviewers highlighted Ty West's confident direction, memorable characters, striking cinematography, and the film's intelligent reinvention of familiar slasher conventions. And that's one sign, that this is a potentially good movie anyway. You can tell that the director had confidence and some sort of vision. So even if you don't think the movie is like particularly great or something, I think most people who criticize the movie would at least admit that it's competently done. I would think they would. I know everybody's a critic, and there's always going to be somebody who's going to trash talk something, but I think I think it's pretty obvious that Ty West knew what he was doing. He had some concrete ideas of what he wanted this film to be, and I think the performances are solid. And many ranked it among the best horror films of 2022. And as the trilogy expanded, appreciation only grew stronger. What initially looked like a stylish slasher evolved into one of the most thematically ambitious horror trilogies of the decade. And I think this movie will have a lasting legacy. I think people will remember it over the years. Perhaps the film's greatest legacy is what it did for Mia Goth's career, already respected among horror fans. Her performance in X, Pearl, and Maxine established her as one of modern horror's defining scream queens, and the trilogy strengthened A24's growing reputation for producing horror films that combine these genre thrills with some rich emotional and psychological storytelling and depth. Rather than relying solely on gore, X actually asks some uncomfortable questions. What happens when beauty fades? What if the what if your greatest dream never comes true? Can ambition survive the passage of time? And what becomes of people who refuse to let go of the past? Can it spiral out of control and potentially lead to violence? Is a lot of violence in society rooted in some of the beliefs and attitudes of somebody like Pearl? Is it sort of an unexplored psychological phenomenon? Like there's obviously an old school belief that you would occasionally hear that serial killers do what they do looking for fame. Uh, I'm sure that's not all that there is, but it certainly could be a significant motivator. And jealousy is another thing. A lot of the worst behaviors that humans engage in, they really have some core roots and psychological problems, and in people just feeling cheated or wronged. And a lot of bad behavior requires some sort of justification for people, and whatever it is, that sometimes they'll find it. And a lot of questions linger long after the credits roll, at least if you're that type of person who can appreciate the depth of a movie. So X succeeds because it works on multiple levels. If you're looking for inventive kills, relentless tension, and old school slasher thrills, it delivers, at least in a basic way. Like I said, I don't think it's the greatest slasher movie of all time or whatever. It's not even the goriest movie or anything like that. It's probably not, going to rank as the scariest movie either. But nevertheless, I like it. And Beneath the Blood is a surprisingly human story about longing, regret, and the universal fear of growing old. And it's a reminder that the most frightening monsters are not always supernatural. That's one of the messages of the movie as well. Sometimes they're simply people confronting the passage of time and refusing to accept it. And that's what makes X far more than just another horror movie. It's a slasher with something meaningful on its mind. Well, anyway, I think I've said enough here. I probably repeated myself a little bit with my talking points. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to subscribe, click a like button if there's one there. Feel free to leave a review, even a comment. Tell me what your thoughts are on this movie. if you disagree, if you think it's just complete trash or whatever. And does this movie qualify as smut? I'm including it as my first smut movie review, uh, and it's kind of a fun choice because it would just barely qualify if it does qualify. I don't know. That might be one of the more interesting questions for this episode. Does this movie qualify as smut? I don't know. It kind of does a little bit, but kind of not. I've reviewed movies that had some nudity in them before, even some taboo elements, and I still didn't consider them smut. Yet for whatever reason, maybe I just wanted to cross over and classify this movie as such a film. Um, I mean, it's certainly not hardcore. It's not like an X-rated film. Um, but a movie doesn't need to be X-rated in order to be smutty. So you can have soft core stuff, and I'll be looking at other unforgettable films from the world of horror and from other genres. I also have episodes where I talk about politics, I talk about music, I talk about this and that and the other. So, and keep watching the shadows because you never know what's waiting in the dark. That would be my closing message for this movie, because these characters, I don't think they quite understood what they were dealing with when they met Pearl, and she is an unforgettable character.